guys, this is the last of the video lectures for the informative module. It's on chapter 6, which is on listening. So we're going to talk about the differences between listening and hearing and how to listen more effectively. So we'll start with what is listening. A lot of people use the words hearing and listening interchangeably, but they're not the same thing. So hearing is a physiological process. Sounds enter your ear and are processed by your brain, but you're not actively necessarily doing anything with that information. You may not even acknowledge it. So there might be a car alarm going off across the street while you're working. You might notice the car alarm, but you're not really listening for it. You're not analyzing the sound of the car alarm or trying to figure out why the car alarm is going off. You're just continuing on with your day. Conversely, listening is a complex group of affective, cognitive, and behavioral processes. Affective processes are those that motivate us to pay attention to a message. Cognitive processes include understanding and interpreting, and behavioral processes include nonverbal and verbal feedback. So one way to look at it would be affective means emotional. In fact, that actually was the original meaning of the word affect, was emotion. Cognitive has to do with thinking, and behavioral has to do with behaving and responding. So in other words, hearing is a passive physical process, and listening is an active mental and emotional process. Here's kind of a breakdown of the differences between listening versus hearing. So hearing is passive, listening is active. Listening refers to the act of hearing refers to the act of perceiving a sound through the ear that should be rearranged, whereas listening refers to the act of making a conscious effort to perceive sound. Hearing does not require any conscious effort, but listening does. Hearing is involuntary and listening is voluntary. So there are 4 main types of listening. So appreciative listening is listening for enjoyment. So that might be listening to music or listening to someone you like to hear talk. Discriminative is listening for meaning beyond the words being spoken. So that would mean listening for nuance, reading between the lines. Comprehensive is listening to recall. So that's what you do during a lecture in theory, is you listen to try to be able to use the information later on in a test. And critical is listening to understand and critically evaluate the words of a message. So to evaluate them for trustworthiness or for truth or for the effectiveness of the message. So there are challenges with listening. I'm sure all of us can think of a time when maybe we didn't listen as well as we might have hoped. So maybe it was a lecture that later on you realized you really didn't remember as much as you wanted to, or maybe you were speaking with a friend and you were really distracted by something that was going on in your life and you wanted to pay attention to that friend, but you couldn't make yourself do it. We've all been there. So we may be distracted by other stimuli or our own thoughts. We may be bored. We may have neurodevelopmental differences that create additional challenges such as ADHD and autism, but we can all work to be better listeners. So 3 main types of listening challenges are listening apprehension, which is the anxiety we feel about listening. So for instance, being stressed about needing to retain information during a difficult lecture. Listening style can also cause some challenges depending on your listening style. So your listening style is your favorite and unconscious approach to listening, or the type of information you're most likely to pay attention to. And a processing approach is passive listening versus active listening. So listening styles, there are, again, 4 main listening styles, as there are others out there. So content-oriented listeners focus on evaluating facts and evidence. So these are the people who are listening for information, but they may miss like the emotional side of things. People-oriented listeners focus on feeling and their conversational partners. So they're going to be really focused maybe on body language or on the emotions, but they may not catch as much information about the meaning. Action-oriented listeners tend to focus on the ultimate point the speaker is trying to make. So what are you getting at? And time-oriented listeners prefer brief and hurried conversations that get to the point. They don't want a whole lot of chit-chat, a lot of small talk that just wants you to get there so they can go. Your processing approach is passive versus active. So passive listening is the habitual and unconscious process of just receiving messages and basically not doing anything with them. It's just basically listening on autopilot. Active listening is the deliberate process of listening to messages and attending to those messages, understanding them, remembering them, evaluating them, or responding to them. So the importance of active listening. So active listening is important because it shows the speaker you're concerned. It leads to getting better information. It encourages further communication, can enhance relationships, helps to calm down someone who's upset, and invites others to listen to you. And it leads to better cooperation and problem solving. So what are some strategies for active listening? This is not a strategy, but I thought this was a really cool comic, so I wanted to include it. The word listen contains the same letters as the word silent. And I think that kind of helps to emphasize, I guess not really emphasize, but it's interesting. It's important to be silent while someone else is speaking, because in order to really listen, you kind of do have to be silent. So strategies for active listening are attending, understanding, remembering, evaluating, and responding. Attending is perceiving and focusing on a message. Understanding is accurately interpreting a message. Remembering is being able to retain and recall information. Evaluating is critically analyzing a message. And responding is providing feedback. So some tips for attending for that first step of listening actively is to get physically ready to listen. So create an environment with minimal distractions. And if you're sitting, sit upright in your chair and look at the person speaking. If you're standing, it can be helpful to orient your body toward them. Try to make eye contact and do what you can to get yourself ready and receptive to attend to their message. Easier said than done, but it also helps to resist mental distractions and consciously work to block out wandering thoughts. And that one's tough. I still struggle with that myself. You also want to hear the person out. So try to stay focused on what the person is saying and resist the impulse to predict what you think they'll say, finish their sentences, or interrupt. Just try to hear everything that they're saying and listen for the messages that they're trying to convey. So some tips for understanding are to try to identify the main point. Ask questions if you need to. It can help to kind of paraphrase or reflect back. So if you're not sure, you might say, what I'm hearing you say is, or if I'm understanding correctly, and then kind of paraphrase what they've said. And empathizing, trying to put yourself in their shoes and understand where they're coming from also really can help to facilitate understanding. So some tips for remembering are to repeat the information, to construct mnemonic devices. Mnemonic devices are, aids for helping you remember. They may be like abbreviations. I can't remember the name of the word for it. But where you have a word, and each letter in the word stands for something. So like fanboys is the 7 coordinating conjunctions. I use that a lot with students for teaching commas. 7 coordinating conjunctions are for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. And they spell fanboys. So fanboys would be a mnemonic device to help someone remember those 7 coordinating conjunctions. And there are a lot of those out there that people make. And then taking notes mentally or with a sheet of paper can also really help you to remember things. So some tips for evaluating are to separate facts from inferences. So your assumptions may or may not be accurate. And so when you're evaluating, it can be helpful to figure out what is fact and what is what you're inferring. And to do that, you can ask for more information. Ask questions and paraphrase like what we talked about before. And this can kind of be a cyclical thing where you're going to want to do that maybe several times in a conversation. Some listening response strategies are to respond appropriately to nonverbal cues. What appropriate is really going to depend on the situation. You know, if someone is scowling at you, I know an example. Someone asked me once. So someone's walking down the street and they give you a nasty look. You don't know them. You know, do you assume that you did something wrong, or maybe do you think, well, they're probably just having a bad day, or they're thinking about something distasteful? If your first assumption is that it's all about you, then you might respond in one way that may not be appropriate to the situation. If your first assumption is that they're probably having a bad day, then maybe you just continue and walk on, or maybe you ask them if they're okay, but you respond differently based on the way that you interpret that. And so responding appropriately, it can be really important to helping facilitate good communication. It's also important to identify the most appropriate type of response. So 2 of them are emotional or supportive or constructive criticism. So an emotional or supportive response is probably going to focus more on the emotions involved, and it may not provide any feedback, it may not provide any solutions. And in some situations, that's going to be the best way to go. In other situations, the person may need that feedback. They may be looking more for solutions than for emotional support. And in those, then you might want to use the constructive criticism. That brings us to the end of this presentation. As I said, these are really short because I know you guys got a lot on your plate. And this is the last one for the informative unit. And I will see you guys soon.